to get religious sanction. And that's something that simply doesn't exist in China because there's no transcendental religion. And so to this day, the Chinese have never had anything like rule of law. They have positive law. They have the emperor making laws saying you must do this, or if you do this, you'll be punished. But they do not have a body of law administered by a hierarchy of jurists, of priests, of legal specialists, the way the Hindus do, that tell the king, you have limits on your power. And so in that respect, I think that's one of the reasons that the Indians never, ever in their history succeeded in developing a centralized, massive dictatorship the way the Chinese did at a very, very early age in their history. And so people today seem to think that the fact that China is a communist dictatorship still and India is a democracy is somehow a product of their recent 20th century history or of their colonial history. Obviously, that had an impact. But I think these patterns go much, much deeper because in China, you've basically had centralized dictatorship with a few breaks, every 300-400 years. In India, you've had the opposite pattern. Decentralized rule, very powerful local societies. Every now and then, somebody gets it in their head to try to unify the society. They do it for maybe 2 or 3 generations, and then the whole project falls apart, up through the Mughals, the Muslim conquerors of India, and up through the British, who in some sense were the most successful, but even they never succeeded in penetrating Indian society.
As you point out in your book, there is a classic piece of literature in India, and there's nothing to match it in China. The literature is the Mahabharata, and in that you have a message that for a king, a leader, who transgresses the law, it is all right to kill him, to depose him, to assassinate, to get rid of. And you cannot imagine that in the Chinese classical literature that anyone was going to long live with this. It was enough that the early Qin dynasty burnt as many books as they could that were Confucian. This book they would have gone to a lot of trouble to destroy. So as you point out, there are only 2 outsiders who ever tried to organize this magnificent civilization. One was the Mughals, so you have a Muslim insertion, and then the second is the British. So in true fashion, which annoys many of my Indian colleagues, by the way, you say, and many can say, that India for the first time was a country in 1947 after the British withdrew and after the partition. So it's very different in many ways that it accepted things from the colonial period, but in fact, it is a still collection, as the British learned the hard lesson, of villages that have a lot to say over what happens within the village. We're jumping a lot because we only have an hour and we could stay for 3 days. You then look across the Middle East and find that a very unusual feature, starting first with the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, these caliphs like Harun al-Rashid and others perceived that it was almost impossible to rule over this dysfunctional group of Arabs who all had their own tradition. And so, north of the Arab lands were these advancing Turkish tribes, Greater Turkmenistan. And so you go and attack them, and you take young males and you bring them back, and you have a slave army. They are not Arabs. They are other people on the border. You raid them, take their children back. They become, but this is a miniature version what's going to follow in the first really great Islamic empire, the Ottomans. The Ottomans had a frontier. It was the entire Balkans, from Vienna south through all those places that you read about in your newspapers, and there was a blood tax, so that a Ottoman group went out and took all the boys they could find in a village, brought them, tore them from their families, brought them to Istanbul, and they trained them, and the best ones became administrators, and the others became soldier warriors of the Sultan, Janissaries. So this was the first time you see a state being built using, am I correct again, an outside force that you simply steal from their parents. Would you comment?
Well, okay, so this really gets back to this enduring theme in the book, which is that the family and family values are actually very destructive of politics in a certain way. If you rely on friends and family, you can create small groups, but you cannot create an empire. You need impersonal recruitment. And the big problem in every civilization, and I would say we'll hopefully get to a discussion of our own civilization soon, but is what I call repatrimonialization, meaning that wealthy elites, wealthy, powerful elites always want to take care of their children or their friends, but primarily their children, and they will use any strategy they can to reinsert their descendants into the power elite of their society. And in the Middle East, this was a particular problem because it's an intensely tribal society. The Arabs and the Turks are both organized according to these very, very strong tribal bounds. And one of the things that the early Abbasid rulers realized was that unless you could somehow break people of these tribal loyalties, you wouldn't create a big army. So in a way, the whole religion of Islam is one attempt to do this, because in Islam, the ummah is not based on family. In fact, there's a lot in the Quran, about your true loyalties belong to the community of believers, not to your tribe. But that wasn't enough to actually create an army that could stay together for any period of time. And so they began to realize that you literally had to capture people out of their families, make sure that they'd never see their parents again in their lifetimes, raise them in the Sultan's household so that the Sultan would be the family, in effect. The loyalty would be to the state. It's probably the most extreme device anyone has come up with for breaking out of this kinship, this natural tendency towards kinship, and it is the basis really of both Arab and Turkish power for quite a number of centuries. And of course, how does this break down? It breaks down because at some point the Janissaries, these slave soldiers that at one point had not been allowed to marry and not allowed to have children, or if they did have children, were expelled from the Janissary Corps. So one of the first things that happens is they start demanding in a period of weakness of the Sultan that their children be promoted and be allowed to be Janissaries in a way that was impermissible in the early days of the empire. And at that point, the writing is on the wall that rule is going to be hereditary. It's going to go to people with inside influence and not people that were specially trained and recruited on the basis of merit.
Now we wade into different waters. At the fall of the Roman Empire, chaos in the West, an institution that was religious in its basis took on also secular powers. That institution was the Christian Church or the Roman Catholic Church, whichever, from Rome. And you have a unique view of the phenomena of the growth of this enormous political institution with all of its far-reaching powers. So I will shut up and you will explain.
Okay. Well, in a lot of modernization theory from Max Weber and other theorists, the Protestant Reformation plays a really big role in the work ethic and the rise of capitalism and so forth. And in my book, I actually think that the Roman Catholic Church played a role in two critical respects that were absolutely essential in allowing the West to modernize as it did. The first is it undermined the extended tribal family. Europe was conquered, or Rome, the Roman Empire, was conquered by Germanic barbarians who were organized in tribal segments. And within 2 generations of their coming into contact with Christianity, these tribes dissolved. And why did this happen? It happened because the Catholic Church in about the 7th or 8th century began to reset the rules of inheritance so that it basically forbade cousin marriage, it forbade marriage within a certain degree of consanguinity, it forbade divorce, it forbade remarriage, it forbade a practice that was common in the Middle East called the levirate, whereas if a wife's husband died, she would then marry the younger brother. All of these are strategies to keep money within the family, to keep it within these relatively narrow tribal groups. And I think the Catholic Church, and this is not doctrinal, they actually decided that if they cut off all of these strategies by which kin groups could pass money to their relatives, that it would end up in the hands of basically widows and spinsters. And what do you think would happen at that point? It all goes to the Catholic Church. And so within 2 or 3 generations in France of the promulgation of this new rule, the Catholic Church goes from owning about 10% of the land in France to owning about 30% because of all of these donations. And so you may laugh about the self-interest of the church, but it had this incredibly important impact. Unlike the Middle East or China or India, you never in Europe really had to deal with extended kin groups. In subsequent periods of European history, feudalism was a contract. It was a contract between two strangers who were not related to each other, and that laid an incredibly important basis for the subsequent flexibility of social relations in Europe. The other really big impact that the church had really was in the rule of law. So as you recall, I said the rule of law is rules that are imposed against secular authorities that secular authorities have to obey. In Europe, this really revolved around this struggle called the investiture conflict that broke out in the 11th century, late in the 11th century. I believe that Pope Gregory VII was probably as titanic a political and religious figure as Martin Luther. And in many respects, his concerns were the same. So at this point in the church's history, priests and bishops could marry. They could have children, and they could pass on their benefices to their children. And Gregory and his papal party saw this as a source of incredible corruption within the church. And he believed, I think correctly, that unless the church got its own act cleaned up, it could not exert the kind of moral authority over the secular princes in the Holy Roman Empire. And in any event, those princes were appointing bishops and priests, and in fact had played a role in the appointment of the last, 8 of the last 9 popes. And so Gregory excommunicated the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. He had to come begging barefoot to Canossa to get absolution. This led to a 2-generation war between the Pope's partisans and the empire, essentially. And at the end of this period, Gregory won the principle of the celibacy of the priesthood within the church, and he won the principle that the church will appoint its own bishops and priests and not the secular authorities. In the process, they uncovered in an attic in northern Italy the Justinian Code, basically the great compilation under the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian of all of the accumulated Roman legislation up until that point. They set up a law school in Bologna that became then famous as the source of education, legal education, for many subsequent generations of Europeans. And this all got codified in terms of ecclesiastical law, administered by a church that was separate from secular authority. This is the critical thing. China never had anything like this. The Indians had this in terms of a Brahmin caste, but they never had the kind of institutional power that the Roman Church did to actually make and actually enforce law. And I think, in many respects, the fact that Western civilization grew up on a legal basis with powerful, independent judicial institutions was, again, very much the product of this early struggle of the church against secular authority. And I'm not just saying this because I'm at a Jesuit school.
That's good to know, because you forgot one important thing. These reforms